Okay.
All right, so this is the last slide that we talked about on Thursday. Yeah, on Thursday. So you don't need to type this down. I usually, if I'm in the middle of a kind of a PowerPoint here, I'll start with the last thing we talked about. So on Thursday, essentially, kind of talking about the kind of the Egyptian society, mainly talking really though about initially when we're talking about the Egyptian government, I was mainly talking about the whole idea how historians like to break down Egyptian history into certain particular eras and times, right? Because it's 3,000 plus years of history. So there's a few questions on the test that we based on, remember they call them those kingdom periods, those kingdom eras. So like during what kingdom period were the Great Pyramids built? Oh, good, right? And that usually starts with the 3rd to 4th dynasties, right? The Old Kingdom period, and in between those kingdom periods, you have what they call intermediate or illness periods, where Egypt is on a decline. So there was 3 of them, essentially, that we had discussed. The first one that was between the Old and Middle Kingdom period was brought on, they believe, by climate change. All right. So we had about 4 dynasties within that 100-year period, which was kind of a lot for Egyptian history. Middle Kingdom period usually marked with the fact that the capital is moved away from Memphis to the city of Thebes. Then also the concept of an afterlife was extended to commoners as a means of kind of creating this kind of social contract. And we'll talk a little bit about today with Mott and that. And then the second illness period was significant because that was the first time we had a dynasty that was established by essentially foreigners in Egypt. Do you remember what they called those people that established the 15th dynasty? It was an Egyptian name which meant rulers of a foreign land, but they viewed them as hillbillies, kind of like Hyksos, yeah, Hyksos. So the Hyksos, while all the histories is written about them is written by the Egyptians. So we don't know exactly who they were, what they called themselves. But remember, they did introduce 2 things to Egypt, despite the Egyptians kind of vilifying them a bit. One was the chariot, which was the main means of kind of transportation, particularly for military matters for the Egyptians. The other one was a metal. What was that? Bronze, right. Definitely know that the Hyksos are going to usher in the Bronze Age to the Egyptians. All right. The Hyksos were finally overthrown by the emergence of the 17th into the 18th dynasty. And the 18th dynasty marks what they call the New Kingdom period. That's the Golden Age. All right. That's the one we know the most about. We had talked about a couple pharaohs in there. Hatshepsut being significant as the first woman to take the title of pharaoh. Although Amanda found another woman that was during the Middle Kingdom period during the 12th dynasty. The thing is, I think that everybody kind of gives Hatshepsut the credits because she took the title pharaoh. Because remember, pharaoh, which initially meant the royal family, was given during the New Kingdom period. That's when it was signified to be king, per se. All right. So, and then we talked about Ramses the Great, who was in the 19th dynasty. He was probably the last of the great kind of pharaohs. He ruled for like 60-something years until he's like 96. Right. He had like 90-something kids. So he took that title of father of his people pretty literally, if you will. And then the third illness period was brought on by another kind of a immersion of kind of like dynasties were established by foreigners. One significant, definitely know, the 27th dynasty established by the Nubians from Kush, not that Kush, but a different Kush. All right. So for about 90 years, we had black pharaohs in Egypt. And then the 31st one was the Greeks. The Ptolemies were Greeks, a mix of Greek and Egyptian. And I talked about kind of social classes. Every civilization here, ancient civilization, basically, you can argue today, your status in society, your status in class is basically based on the types of jobs that you do, right? So right below the pharaoh and their family were the nobles, which included that title vizier, which was the chief advisor, like Imhotep was a vizier. All right. You have then like kind of wealthy merchants, generals, tax collectors, and then the largest class, what I classify as peasants, but it's really your middle class. Those are basically the people who do the kind of the everyday work, the laborers, the farmers, scribes, artisans, and then the lowest of the low in almost all these kind of societies and civilizations are slaves. Now, much of what we know about Egyptian slavery, mainly during the New Kingdom period. Right, we talked about how after kind of conquering the lands of Nubia to the south, before the Nubians, the Kushites established the 27th dynasty, many of them worked in the gold mines in Upper Egypt, which was the toughest work. But you had others working in agriculture and stuff. You had certain groups, famously like Jews, who kind of migrated into Egypt during the New Kingdom period for whatever reason were turned into slaves. There's other cultures that were like that, probably as a reaction to the Hyksos to a certain extent. So all those civilizations, we'll talk about kind of social structure and stuff. So what I want to talk about today is religion, and then certain aspects of kind of cultural contributions the Egyptians made. So in religion, in Egyptian religion, and we'll always discuss religion in the sense of kind of how it pertains to kind of society, how it kind of influences politics, how it influences also, like, trying to explain the unexplainable, if you will. Within Egyptian religion, there's an important concept that is somewhat unique to Egypt to a certain extent, but you could argue maybe the Romans have it with gravitas or the Greeks have it with our reach, is this concept of Ma'at, which I talked a little bit about. Ma'at is a concept, it's a philosophy, but it's also represented by a deity, a goddess, all right, and an image of a ostrich feather, all right. And so when we were talking about the Middle Kingdom period, when we extend the concept of an afterlife to commoners, there's this idea of Ma'at, which dates back to the Old Kingdom period, that really took precedent. So the idea of truth, justice, and order, you should live your life according to this. All right, how you live your life according to this will determine whether you can gain access into the afterlife. All right, like I was saying, in Judeo-Christianity, this concept of heaven and hell, if you will, to a certain extent. But what this does is create somewhat of a social contract amongst the Egyptians. All right, and it was probably during the Middle Kingdom period one of the factors that led to kind of people getting the idea of having a concept of afterlife. Now, religiously speaking, like 98% of these kind of ancient civilizations, the Egyptians were polytheistic, which means what? Believed in multiple deities. There's a pantheon of Egyptian gods and goddesses. There's an extensive creation story, if you will. And I'll always, do you guys, I mean, I've asked this, and anybody take mythology or has taken it or whatever? So some of this stuff, it's cliff notes for you, right? But there's, a lot of these civilizations, you have different tiers of gods and goddesses, right? Some that I want you to know during what they refer to as the Golden Age are as such here. First one up here, Amen, sometimes spelled with the U, sometimes with an E as well, is the god of air. Amen is a deity that gains prominence during the Middle Kingdom period. Amen's kind of like when Thebes becomes the capital. The cult of Amen is elevated. Like at Karnak in Thebes, the temple of Karnak is dedicated to the god Amen. Now, a lot of these deities are also associated with animals. Sometimes they're portrayed as having kind of heads of animals. Amen is usually portrayed in kind of like a human form. The name, like loosely translated, means like he without form or whatever. But I think it's the ram and the goose that are usually associated with Amen. Now, at one point, the Egyptians are going to combine Amen with an older deity named Ra into one creatively known as Amen-Ra. All right. Ra is usually portrayed as having the head of a hawk. All right. And it's confused with another deity that we'll talk a little bit later. Now, later when the Greeks come to Egypt, they combine Amen with Zeus in a name that's cleverly referred to as Amen Zeus. All right. And so when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he goes to the temple of Amen and basically he's told he's the son, he's a god, basically. All right. Now, in a lot of these cultures, like we talk about Greek mythology, we talk about Hera and Zeus and stuff like that. You have these, and we talked about that in Sumer and stuff. You have this brother and sister, husband and wife kind of like duo. All right. The most famous one is in the myth of Osiris. All right. So you have Osiris, who is the god of the dead, but wasn't always the god of the dead. All right. Was kind of like the god of the sky, god of the universe, and that. And his sister wife, Isis, who is the goddess of fertility. All right. Osiris is also associated with male fertility and agriculture as well. All right. And so, are you familiar with the myth of Osiris? Right? Did Mr. White tell you guys about this story? But you know about it? Okay. Okay. Yeah. And so in the story, right, Osiris has a brother named Set, sometimes Seth or whatever. Like apparently, I think it was a story. It was like a banquet. They're having like a get together, and he tricks him into getting into a box. Right, which is essentially a coffin, and then then sets him into the Nile, and then he eventually makes his way to what is Byblos in what we'll talk about Phoenicia on Thursday. Isis is distraught. She goes to look for him, actually with Seth's wife behind his back, or who was also her sister. They find him; he's embedded into a tree that was cut down. Right, and when they take him out, he's dead. Right, and so Isis then tries to hide his body in kind of a marshy area. Set finds him, and what does Set do with him? You remember? He chops him up. All right. And in one story, he chops him into 42 pieces, sends them all throughout Egypt, and Isis has to find him. Those 42 pieces represented the 42 gnomes. All right. And so she puts them together with all but one important body part for producing children. I'll let you figure out which one that is. And then with a lot of these myths, you have to basically kind of like suspend disbelief and just come to accept it. So they have a child who we'll talk about that eventually avenges Osiris. All right. As a result, he becomes, while he is like essentially kind of resurrected, he is not alive. So he becomes the god of the underworld. And everybody who dies has to go through the underworld. All right, and it's his final judgment that determines whether you can get to go into the afterlife. All right, so kind of keep on going. This is an image of Amun-Ra. Like I said, the other image of just strictly Amun tends to be kind of one in just human form. This is the image of Osiris. Like I said, he's usually portrayed in human form as like blue or greenish skin, which signifies he's dead, basically. But he's wearing the crown of the pharaoh, which signified his time as the head of the world there. And then he also always has these reeds, all right, this staff and reed, which is associated with shepherds. All right. This is an image of him from Abu Simbel, which, like I was telling you, like Ramses would have a lot of the statues of him. Like this is him, and right next to it is Osiris, because he kicks it with the gods. All right, and then this is Isis, an image of Isis. Now later, when the Romans take over Egypt, Isis becomes a popular cult in Rome amongst the elites. It's kind of chic to be kind of a part of this. So there's temples dedicated to Isis that you would find in Italy. All right, it was one of these deities that was able to transcend other cultures, if you will. All right, and so in that story of the conflict between Osiris and Set, the offspring that Isis and Osiris have after he's kind of put back together partially there is the god Horus. All right, Horus is the god of sky and light. He kind of takes the place of Osiris. He battles his uncle Set to avenge that. All right, did Mr. White tell you that story? That story between Set and Horus?
I think so.
Yeah, it's a battle. I'm not going to basically go into it because I may get in trouble for it. I'm just gonna, if you want to look it up later, all right, you can look at kind of research it. I'll just put it this way: you probably will look at Salad differently. All right, I'm just going to say that. And so after defeating Set, Horus becomes the god of sky and light. All right, and one of his powers is that he bestows power to the pharaohs. All right, and then he's also portrayed as as a falcon, all right, like a hawk, like that. So him and Ra tend to get mixed up a bit. And then the deity that helped Isis put Osiris back together is Anubis, the god of embalming, the god of mummification. All right, and he's usually portrayed as having the head of a jackal, which is associated with the fact that jackals would dig up bodies, like when bodies were buried in the desert. All right, so these are some of the important deities within Egyptian mythology. This is an image of Horus. Like I said, he's got the bowling pin crown there, signifies his connection to the pharaohs. Another symbol that's associated with Horus, as well as Ra, is the widget, which is the eye, sometimes referred to as the eye of Horus. It represents sacrifice, because in the story, in the battle between him and Set, Set knocked out his eye, but instead of basically putting his eye back, he offered it to his father. All right, and also the teardrop here, I believe, has some association with the creation of man. I was explained that also they would use the widget to try in math to explain the concept of fractions. But I am not very good at math, and I never fully understood how that worked out. But this is also referred to as the Eye of Ra, because they both are similar, if you will. And at one point, they actually combined Horus and Ra into a deity named not Horus, but Horati Ra. All right, so there's a lot of combining here with the Egyptians. And then there's Anubis as the embalmer. All right, and I think this shows Osiris here, Anubis, and Horus. All right, all together. This is at a tomb, a mural in the tomb there. Now, like I said, with Osiris is an important deity here because everybody's guy when they die has to go through the underworld. All right, you got to go through the underworld before you get to make it to the afterlife. Now, to help people out, the Egyptians started writing these cheat codes, if you will, referred to as funerary texts. And probably the most famous funerary text is what they refer to as the Book of the Dead. All right. Now, actually, the translation, I can never remember this. The translation for this, the actual Egyptian translation for the Book of the Dead is the book of coming forth by day, or spells for going forth by day, which the Book of the Dead is a lot easier to remember. All right. And so what it's basically, it's buried with the person to help them get through the underworld. All right. So they can eventually make it into the afterlife. Which, like I said, the Egyptians have a better concept than the Sumerians did. I'm going to play this short little video from TED Ed that talks about the importance of the Book of the Dead.
Ani stands before a large golden scale where the jackal-headed god Anubis is weighing his heart against a pure ostrich feather. Ani was a real person a scribe from the Egyptian city of Thebes who lived in the 13th century BCE. And depicted here is a scene from his Book of the Dead, a 78-foot papyrus scroll designed to help him attain immortality. Such funerary texts were originally written only for pharaohs, but with time, the Egyptians came to believe regular people could also reach the afterlife if they succeeded in the passage. Ani's epic journey begins with his death. His body is mummified by a team of priests who remove every organ except the heart, the seat of emotion, memory, and intelligence. It's then stuffed with a salt called natron and wrapped in resin-soaked linen. In addition, the wrappings are woven with charms for protection and topped with a heart scarab amulet that will prove important later on. The goal of the 2-month process is to preserve Ani's body as an ideal form with which his spirit can eventually reunite. But first, that spirit must pass through the duat, or underworld. This is a realm of vast caverns, lakes of fire, and magical gates, all guarded by fearsome beasts. Snakes, crocodiles, and half-human monstrosities with names like He Who Dances in Blood. To make things worse, Apep, the serpent god of destruction, lurks in the shadows, waiting to swallow Ani's soul. Fortunately, Ani is prepared with the magic contained within his Book of the Dead. Like other Egyptians who could afford it, Ani customized his scroll to include the particular spells, prayers, and codes he thought his spirit might need. Equipped with this arsenal, our hero traverses the obstacles, repels the monster's attacks, and stealthily avoids Apep to reach the hall of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. Here, Ani faces his final challenge. He is judged by 42 assessor gods, who must be convinced that he has lived a righteous life. Ani approaches each one, addressing them by name and declaring a sin he has not committed. Among these negative confessions, or declarations of innocence, he proclaims that he has not made anyone cry, is not an eavesdropper, and has not polluted the water. But did Ani really live such a perfect life? Not quite, but that's where the heart scarab amulet comes in. It's inscribed with the words, "Do not stand as a witness against me," precisely so Ani's heart doesn't betray him by recalling the time he listened to his neighbor's fight or washed his feet in the Nile. Now it's Ani's moment of truth, the weighing of the heart. If his heart is heavier than the feather, weighed down by Ani's wrongdoings, it'll be devoured by the monstrous Amit, part crocodile, part leopard, part hippopotamus, and Ani will cease to exist forever. But Ani is in luck. His heart is judged pure. Ra, the sun god, takes him to Osiris, god of the underworld, who gives him final approval to enter the afterlife. In the endless and lush field of reeds, Ani meets his deceased parents. Here there is no sadness, pain, or anger, but there is work to be done. Like everyone else, Ani must cultivate a plot of land, which he does with the help of a Shabti doll that had been placed in his tomb. Today, the papyrus of Ani resides in the British Museum, where it has been since 1888. Only Ani, if anyone, knows what really happened after his death. But thanks to his Book of the Dead, we can imagine him happily tending his crops for all eternity.
All right, so this is another famous kind of scroll here from another scribe by the name of Chenifer, which was roughly around the same time. All right, and so it's essentially basically multiple scenes all kind of in one. So Chenifer is, his heart is being weighed. His heart is being weighed against the feather of Ma'at. All right, and so and you see here there's Anubis. So from the looks of it, is his heart heavier or lighter than the feather of Ma'at? Lighter. So as a result, and then Osiris will determine he gets to go into the afterlife. Now, if it was heavier than that, it would be devoured by this creature named Amit, which was a mix of a crocodile. Here it's a lion, like the video said, it was like a leopard, but the hind legs of a hippopotamus. The heart would be devoured, and then the ka would never meet back up with the body. Right? For the Egyptians, that was awful. You basically your ka wandered eternally. All right. But as a result here, whenever it gets to go into the afterlife, all right, this region that is being kind of discussed here, the video refers to as Dawat. Another term for it is Amente. They're both the same. All right. I believe Amente is more the Greek term. All right. Dawat would have been what the Egyptians probably used in more detail, but it's the region of the dead. It's the underworld. And then you get to go on to, like it says there, the field of reeds or the field of rushes, a place called Yaru. All right. It's like heaven. It's basically like Earth, like life is on Earth, but better. All right. There's no anger, there's no sadness, all this other stuff. But you got to do a little bit of work for Osiris. It's usually agricultural work, so that's why they were buried with those little dolls, and those dolls would do the work for you. So the Book of the Dead was important because it would help you not only get to the underworld, but kind of like how you can enjoy Yaru a little bit more as well. All right. So these are important kind of texts to help people kind of and give people hope to a certain extent. All right, that they're going to kind of be like, eventually they'll make it to Yaru. All right. Now, like I said, initially here, the Egyptians are polytheistic, with a brief moment, though, during the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom period. All right. During the reign of a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep IV. All right. Now, this is after Hatshepsut, but before Ramses. All right. And so Amenhotep IV tries to do a 180 for Egyptian culture. He tries to make it monotheistic, all right, and basically says the only deity that matters is this deity referred to as Aten, which is a sun god, but not to be confused with Ra. Aten was the disk that represented the sun, all right. So to show his kind of reverence to this new deity, he changes his name to Akhenaten, he who is in service of Aten. So that's basically what he kind of is known by more than Amenhotep IV. All right, because you see Amen in there, all right, because kind of that's with the old religion. Akhenaten represents the new religion, all right. So when I was talking about Ramses, I said every statue of Ramses, no matter if he was 25 or 90, he always looked like he was perpetually 25. He was stacked, he was built, he was ripped, all right. A lot of these pharaohs are almost indistinguishable by how they look. Not the case with Akhenaten. Akhenaten, you could tell a statue of Akhenaten almost immediately, because this is what he primarily looks like. I don't know if you can see over there. All right. What about Akhenaten's statue is somewhat unique? What's he look like?
Very feminine.
Very feminine. That's a good point. All right. Particularly, they focus on the hips a little bit here. He has very feminine hips. He's even kind of a little bit of a pooch there. All right. His face is very elongated. Now, there's a theory. He may have had a condition where that's his actual representation. Or there's also a theory that Aten basically is this kind of non-gender like kind of deity. There's no male or female connotation to Aten. And that this was his nod to that kind of mixing male and female. All right. Some people even say it's a nod to his wife, who was also his co-ruler. All right. And that was the queen, as the second one, Nefertiti, okay, who's one of the more famous wives of the pharaoh. Nefertiti and him had, I believe, I think it was three. I've seen 3 to 4 daughters, but he didn't have a son. All right. Now back to the kind of the new religion. He also essentially kind of moves the capital away from Thebes, which is associated with Amen, to a new city that he could build. He's kind of like how later in history Constantine moves officially the capital away from Rome to Constantinople. All right. It kind of reflected his new faith. This city is referred to as Akhetaten. They refer to it today as Amarna. So they refer to this period in Egyptian history as the Amarna period. And so there is evidence, though, that the Egyptians, kind of Akhenaten was maybe too concerned with kind of creating this new religion, kind of turning society upside down. The Hittites took advantage. They kind of gained territory from the Egyptians at this point. All right. Now, after Akhenaten dies, the religion doesn't last very long. There's a couple pharaohs after him that one is a female that they don't really know too much about. Another one, the name sounds very similar to Nefertiti, that Dr. Hawass, who's the guy who was in the video, maybe believed that she took the title of pharaoh for a little bit. All right. But what we do know is that one of his male successor was his son from a minor wife. His initial name was Tutankamen. Right. And Tutankamen actually married one of the daughters of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. All right. So his half sister really tended to do that. But eventually he changes his name. All right. He changes his name to Tutankhamen. All right. Ushering back the old religion. All right. And so while we know him as King Tut and the kind of treasurer that he is, he does play an important role in Egyptian culture, is that he basically reverts Egypt back to the old kind of polytheistic religion. All right, and also it kind of changes society because Akhenaten didn't make a lot of friends, all right, particularly amongst the priestly class, those who were kind of dedicated to Amun and all the other various deities. They not only lost position in society, they lost wealth as well. All right, so the religion doesn't last very long, but it is one of the first attempts for. I mean, this is before, you know, this is kind of unique. This, like I said, this is before Ramses. All right, Ramses regains a lot of the territory that was lost by Akhenaten. This is what they believe is a temple in Akhenaten and Amarna. Now, the thing about the temples that were there is that they believe none of them had roofs. Why is that? Why do you think they were roofless? What's the purpose of not having a roof?
Let the sun.
Yeah, let the sun. All right, to kind of worship the sun. So it's been kind of archaeologically kind of excavated and such. This is a statue of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. This is probably the more famous image of Nefertiti. This is a bust that was uncovered in Egypt that's in the museum in Berlin. When a lot of times people talk about Cleopatra and her beauty and stuff like that, sometimes the story is kind of related more into with Nefertiti. All right, and then this is an interesting image that they found at what I believe was a temple at Akhenaten and Amarna. All right, this is Akhenaten with one of his daughters and Nefertiti with two of the daughters. All right, now if you guys can see this, what is it? What's kind of peculiar about that image? What do they look like?
They look creepy little humans.
They look like aliens to a certain extent, like particularly the children, right? And then again, there's that little pooch thing he's got going on. All right, that show Ancient Aliens. They focused on this, and the one guy's like, obviously it's aliens. All right, like this is probably supposed to be Aten, the sun, right? You see the rays there in that show. I think they were saying that's obviously an UFO. All right, that's some type of terrestrial spaceship or something like that. But we're not totally sure. This does create a little bit of intrigue, all right? But definitely Akhenaten, you could definitely know that's the pharaoh they're talking about because his image is very distinguishable from the other ones. And then there's the funerary mask of King Tut, right? Moving on here to some kind of cultural contributions. We know a lot about kind of Egyptian culture thanks to the fact that the Egyptians wrote stuff down, right? And so, like I was telling you, the Sumerians, their style of writing is called cuneiform. The Egyptians is hieroglyphics. It's Greek, meaning Egyptian, picture writing, basically. It's extensive. It's initially kind of an ideogram type of like language there, where one image represents a whole word ideas, but you also have what they call phonograms, which basically some stuff represent later sounds. All right, we'll talk about the Phoenicians on Thursday that kind of develop an entire kind of written system based on that. But then you have combined ones there. It's a very, again, like the amount of people who can read or write is somewhat debatable. Probably, not similar to what Sumer had. We do know that the Egyptians wrote on paper. Our word for paper comes from the term papyrus, which was the reed, the plant that grew in the marshes that they would use. Remember, Sumer didn't have that. They were mainly using kind of mud, clay, and stuff like that. The god Thoth, who was the god of scribes and writing, was an ibis, a crane. They gave him that head because you would find those cranes in the marshlands where you would find papyrus. The concept of paper, though, that we have comes from the East. Papyrus is kind of expensive, if you will. So this is the image of kind of what they call those phonograms. The Egyptians, while they see like A and U and stuff like that, didn't really have concepts of vowels. They did have like consonant sounds, but no concepts of vowels. All right. And then we know a lot about Egyptian hieroglyphics because there is a skeleton key, if you will, to decipher that, something called the Rosetta Stone. All right, that was discovered in 1799 when the French, led by Napoleon, invaded Egypt. The video I talked about that last week, where the French soldiers were basically kind of dismantling a wall, and this kind of granite stone kind of tumbled over with writing on it. Now, what it had was three forms of writing. They had two forms of Egyptian hieroglyphics. One, an older hieroglyphics, another one called the Demotic script. The language changes over time, but the big thing was Greek. All right. Much like how you have in your textbooks, you have like a kind of English and Spanish glossary. That's what the Rosetta Stone was. So linguists knew Greek, and then they could see the patterns in the other languages were able to decipher. Now the language program, the Rosetta Stone, if you look on there, the image is essentially the shape of this Rosetta Stone. So up here is the old hieroglyphics. Here's the Demotic script, and down here is the Greek. Basically, what it was a decree written during the time of the Ptolemies basically praising the new pharaoh Ptolemy V. They believe it was at a temple in Memphis. And then today it's in the British Museum in London. The British took it over after defeating Napoleon. All right, so it's there. So like this girl right here who seems very enthralled, you guys are pretty enthralled about seeing this. I've been to the British Museum a couple times. It's kind of cool seeing it, but this girl obviously is not that impressed. And then a few more things, like I don't think I have you guys write anything down here, kind of moving along here. The Egyptians do have a concept of math. I used to have you guys, if it wasn't for COVID, you guys would have been doing a worksheet on Egyptian math. I skipped that, but numbers, pretty simple, kind of like there's like, dashes for single numbers. You even had a concept of kind of fractions that, but once you got over 100, got it high. Like the image, like the symbol for a million was literally some dude holding his hands up in the air, like, I don't know how the hell count this high. All right. I'm not making you do Egyptian math though. So you're welcome. You would have had more appreciation for your math teachers. Also too, there's obviously with the pyramids, this concept of geometry, surveying to make sure to kind of like tracking the floodwaters. What I would want you to know, though, is the development of a calendar. The Egyptians did to know when the floodwaters were coming. They developed a kind of extensive calendar to know when to plant and harvest, and that divided into 12 months. All right, you had basically 30 days in a month, but there was like 10-day weeks, so it was basically 3 weeks. And at the end, they tacked on 5 days for holidays and feasts. So a 365-day calendar, all right, which was pretty close to ours. All right, mainly for observing for the floods. And then the last thing here, the Egyptians the Egyptians, particularly when the Greeks came there, Egyptian doctors and kind of like, were well respected in the ancient world. They believe they knew how to check a person like for their kind of pulse and their heart rate and stuff like that. We do know they knew how to set broken bones. They even had prosthetics. Also, the Greeks kind of elevated like kind of the use of like kind of remedies for things like headaches to whatever ails and ailments and stuff like that. It was kind of elevated to that position. All right. Like I said, prosthetics. This is what they believe is a prosthetic foot that dates back to the New Kingdom period. It seems to me that would probably be used just for aesthetics and not for function. It seemed like that'd be kind of hard to walk around in. But again, it was kind of something that was kind of developed at that time. All right, so done talking about Egypt. All right, like I said, I'm going to give you guys a worksheet tomorrow on Tut, and then we'll start on the next section, which is essentially the Phoenicians, Hittites, and Hebrews. So we are done.